Hi, everybody. We're talking about background knowledge today. And as you move through the ERLA color levels, authors are going to expect you to have some background knowledge on certain topics, such as maybe history, science, geography, politics, literature, etc. And you'll be able to understand harder books when you have more background knowledge about nonfiction topics. So, how do we gain those? We want to make sure that we are reading and exposing ourselves to nonfiction text and museums and other nonfiction, maybe TV shows and things of that nature. The more we build our background knowledge, the more we'll understand even topics in fiction text. So, what are some topics that Mike Lupica expects us to know? We're going to generate a list of those topics based on what we read in chapter 1. And then we're going to add to that list as we read chapter 2 today. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Move this out of the way. And I'm going to add one already to this list. So one thing that they already assume we know is where certain places in New York are located. So I was able to do a little research, find those maps, and share that with you yesterday. However, if you were reading this on your own, that's something that you could decide to do a mini research on, so that way you could visually kind of picture where all of these things were located. Today, as we read chapter 2, there are some Spanish words, or I should say Cuban words, that our characters in our story are going to say. So I want to introduce those and preview those with you first before we start reading. And obviously we can add this too to our text, that Cuban vocabulary. Now, our author does sometimes give us some context clues to help us understand them as well, and we'll talk about context clues another day, but I'm going to preview them with you first. So, Poppy, I've actually created this document on Word. I'm going to be using this throughout all of Heat. You may want to create one yourself for the vocabulary words that you don't understand as we're reading through, so that way you can build on your vocabulary as well. So if we're reading through and I didn't identify something and you don't know it, that can be added to this list of things that the author assumed you know. So we have Poppy. Poppy is in Spanish. Chorizo is in Spanish. Guataca is in Spanish. And Brigitte is in Spanish. Probably butchered that one, and I apologize. I did listen to it before I said it, but so Papi means father. It's going to be said a lot in our text. So that's definitely one we want to remember. Chorizo is great if you go to any restaurant in our area in Rehoboth. Guarantee you'll see chorizo on the menu. Maybe it's on, sometimes they put it in a taco. Sometimes they put it on nachos. It's yummy. It's Cuban sausage. Usually has peppers and onions and things, and some garlic seasoning. Guataca, we're going to hear that. It means like a brown noser or a flatterer, somebody who wants to, show off a little bit. And the last word is a thin person. It's just another word that they use that represents a thin person. So I would keep this document and continue to add to it for our vocabulary. For heat vocabulary. And then in your INB today, you can add some topics that the author assumes you already know, but maybe you don't. So it's something that you can choose to do a mini research on later. So I'm going to stop my share. And today we're going to be doing chapter 2 of Heat. So when we finished chapter 1 yesterday, we were introduced to Ramon and Mrs. Cora, and Ramon had stolen Mrs. Cora's purse. Mrs. Cora had some money in her purse, and as Ramon was had his plan in his mind, and he was crossing Macklem's Dam Park, all of a sudden he was knocked out. And he was knocked out by Michael Arroyo, who had thrown the ball from home plate to center field, knocking him out. Pretty awesome. And then the cop was able to arrest Ramon and take him away. Chapter 2. Poppy was the first to tell Michael Arroyo he had the arm. Michael thought it was just something a father would say to a son, but he knew there was a look Poppy would get when he said it. As though he were seeing things Michael couldn't, back when it was just the two of them playing catch on that poor excuse of a field behind their apartment building in Pinar del Rio outside of Havana. So I took a moment again to pull up Havana is in Cuba, and you can see here then to get an idea, here is Florida for us. So Cuba is the island right below Florida, and then Havana is actually the capital, so it's right here in Cuba. So that is where they are from. Back home, what Michael still thought of as home, he couldn't help himself. Everybody knew his father, Victor Arroyo, but he was Poppy to Michael and his brother Carlos. Always had been, always would be. You cannot teach somebody to have an arm like yours, Poppy would say, walking out from behind the plate and sticking the ball back inside of Michael's glove, like they were having a conference on the mound during a game. It's something you are born with, a gift from the gods, like a singer's voice, or a boxer's left hand, or an artist's paintbrush. This was when Michael was 7 years old, maybe 8, long before they got on the boat that night last year, the one that took them across the water to a place on the Florida map called Big Pine Key. Someday, Poppy would say, you will make it to the World Series, like the brothers Hernandez did. But before that, my son, what comes first? Michael always knew what the answer was supposed to be. First, the Little League World Series, he would say to his father. On ESPN, Poppy would say, grinning at him, the worldwide leader in sports. So if you don't have background knowledge in things like the Little League World Series, or ESPN, those might be ones that you want to add to your list. Poppy always made it sound as if that was supposed to be Michael's first great dream in baseball, to make it to the Little League World Series in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Poppy always showing him Pennsylvania on the ancient spinning globe they kept in the living room for the world's championship of 11 and 12-year-old baseball boys. Michael knew better, even then. Michael knew that it was more of his father's dream than his own. Poppy had grown up in a time when a star Cuban baseball player, which Michael knew Poppy sure had been as a young man, could never think about escaping to America the way others would later, the most prominent lately being the Yankee pitcher Ricardo Gonzalez, El Grande, he was known. So Poppy, a shortstop on the national team in his day, never made it out, never made the great stage of the major leagues. He became a coach of the Little League boys instead, in charge of grooming them, even then to become stars later for Castro's national team. If you don't have any background knowledge on who Castro is, you may want to look that up. And from the time he saw that Michael had the arm, he had talked about the two of them traveling to Williamsport together and having their games shown around the world. Even now, Michael couldn't tell where Poppy's dream ended and his own began. The dream had moved, of course, from Pinar del Rio to the Bronx, New York. Poppy was no longer his coach, and Michael was no longer a little boy. He had grown into the tallest player on his team during the regular season and now the tallest on his all-star team. It was the all-star team from the Bronx that Michael's left arm was supposed to take all the way to Williamsport in a few weeks, as long as he didn't get found out first. His brother Carlos had promised they could have a catch behind the building when he finished his day shift at the Imperial, the food market across 161st Street next to McDonald's, almost directly underneath the subway platform. This was before Carlos went off to his night job, the one he said he had him bussing tables at Hector's Bronx Cafe. A few stops on the 4 train. Carlos had said he had lied about his age to get the job at Hector's, telling them he was 18 already, and no one had bothered to ask him for a birth certificate. The main reason for that, Carlos had told Michael, was that he was being paid off the books, making it sound like a secret mission almost. What does that mean, off the books? Michael had asked. Carlos said, it means, little brother, that this is the perfect job for me, at least for the time being, in the eyes of official persons. I don't even exist. Carlos was always talking about official persons as if they were the bad guys in some television show. Now, cooking their Saturday morning breakfast of pancakes and chorizo, their Cuban sausage, Carlos smiled at his brother and said, "My little brother Miguel, the hero of the South Bronx." "Guataca," Michael said, flatterer. "Just eat your breakfast," Carlos said. "You're turning into a freaking scarecrow, Miguel, even thinner than a Brigitte." It was a Cuban expression for a thin person. In the small, rundown apartment, their conversation was always a combination of Spanish and English, their old life and their new one. It was only here, when it was just the two of them, that Carlos would even call his little brother by his first name, Miguel. To everyone else, it was always Michael. I wonder why he didn't keep his own real name. Michael still thought of Havana as home because he was born there, and he had been Michael Arroyo there. Miguel Arroyo there, actually. Here he was Michael. "You're not exactly a heavyweight boxer yourself," Michael said. "I have an excuse," Carlos said, "running from one job to another. And then running from table to table, right?" Michael said. Carlos smiled at him. "Right," he said, "like I am passing plates in a relay race instead of the baton." "Maybe I could get a job," Michael said. Carlos laughed. "And maybe you're too busy fighting crime somehow, turning baseballs into guided missiles." "I told you," Michael said. "It was a lucky throw. I saw him running. I heard the policeman." "Then you just managed to hit him in the back of the head hard from how many feet away?" Michael grinned. "The trick is leading him just right." He jumped up from his chair, his mouth full, made a throwing motion like a quarterback leading his favorite wide receiver. Then he added, "If it, if I'd known it was that purse you got for Mrs. C on her birthday, I would have run after him and hit him with a bat." "Mrs. C is telling the whole building you were meant to be on the field, like you were an angel," Carlos said. "The only angels are in the American League West," Michael said, "with halos on their caps." He poured more Aunt Jemima syrup on his stack with a flourish, finishing as though dotting an I. "If there are real angels in the world," Michael said to his brother, "how come they're never around when we need them?" "Don't talk like that," putting some snap into his voice like he was snapping a towel at Michael. Michael looked over and saw him at the counter opening an envelope, making a face, tossing it in a drawer. "Why not? It's true," Michael said. Poppy said, "If we had all the answers, we wouldn't have anything to ask God later." "I want to ask him things now." "Eat your pancakes," Carlos said, then changed the subject, asking if there was all-star practice today. Michael said no, but a bunch of the guys were going to meet at Maccombs Dam Park before the Yankee game. "It must be a national TV game," Carlos said. "If it's at 4 o'clock. Who's pitching, by the way?" "He is." "El Grande? I thought he just pitched Wednesday in Cleveland." "Tuesday," Michael said. "Today is his scheduled day." "That means another sellout." "The Yankees sell out every game now." "It just seems like they squeeze more people in when El Grande pitches," Carlos said. What's his record now since his family came? 5-0? 6-0 with an earned run average of 1.45. If you don't know if that's good or not, that might be something you want to look up. "Before the season is over, we'll get 2 tickets and watch him pitch in person," Carlos said. "I promise. You know we can't afford them." "Don't tell me what we can and can't afford," Carlos said, slamming his palm down on the counter, not just snapping now, yelling. It happened more and more these days, Carlos exploding this way when he was on his way to one of his jobs like a bursting thunder out of nowhere, one you didn't even know was coming. "Sorry," Michael said, lowering his eyes. Carlos came right over, put his hand on Michael's shoulder. "No, Miguel, I'm the one who's sorry. I'm a little tired today is all." "We're cool," Michael said. "That's right," Carlos said. "Who's cooler than the Aurora boys?" He said he was going to get dressed for work, but had to pull out the stupid ironing board and iron his stupid Imperial Markets shirt first. The one, he said, as if it should belong to a bowling team. When he was gone from the kitchen, Michael went over and quietly opened the drawer where Carlos had thrown the envelope. That could be another one if you don't know what a bowling shirt looks like. Look that up. It was their Con Ed bill, the same bill Carlos had been slamming in the drawer for the past 3 months. We do need an angel, Michael thought. Michael read the daily news when his brother was gone, going over the box scores of last night's game as if studying for a math test. Then he listened to sports radio. to all the excited voices talking about how this would be a playoff atmosphere this afternoon because the Yankees and the Red Sox were tied for first place in the American League West. At least this was a Yankee game Michael would be able to watch on his own television. When it was a cable game on the Yankees' own network, he would occasionally ask Mrs. Cora if he could watch at her apartment. If there was nothing special on she wanted to watch, she would always say yes. Mostly Michael knew because she liked the company, even if she didn't really like baseball. Michael knew Mrs. Cora had a daughter who had run off young, but she didn't talk about her too often, so Michael didn't ask. Sometimes, with Carlos's permission, he would go and watch the night games at his friend Manny's apartment a few blocks up near the Bronx County Courthouse, as long as Manny's mother would walk him home afterward. Carlos promised they would get cable the way he promised they would get to see El Grande pitch in person. There were all kinds of dreams in this apartment, Michael thought. Sometimes he didn't care whether the game was on television or not. Even if his man was on the mound, Michael would take his transistor radio and go outside on the fire escape, the one that was on the side of the building facing 158th Street, and sit facing the stadium and listen to the crowd as much as he did the real Yankee announcers. Hearing the cheers float out the top of the place and race straight up the hill to where he sat. From where not even 100 yards away, he could see the outside white wall of Yankee Stadium and the design at the top that reminded Michael of some kind of white picket fence. The opening there, he knew, was way up above right field, pennants for the Mariners and Angels and Oakland Athletics blowing in the baseball breezes. Just down the street and a world away, Michael Arroyo would sit here, and when the announcers would talk about El Grande Gonzalez going into his windup, the windup that Michael could imitate perfectly, even though he was left-handed and El Grande was right-handed, he would be able to imagine everything. Michael's teammates called him Little Grande sometimes, even though he was bigger than most of them. The ones who spoke Spanish called him El Grandecito. He didn't even try to understand why throwing a baseball came easy to him when he could throw it as hard as he did and he put it where he wanted to most of the time, whether he was pitching to a net or to other 12-year-old stars on the South Bronx Clippers, named in honor of the Yankees' top farm team, the Columbus Clippers. Michael Arroyo knew, just knew, that when he was rolling a ball around in his left hand before he put it he would put it in his glove and then duck his head behind the glove the way El Grande did, everything felt right in the world. He wasn't mad at anyone or worried about what might happen to him and his brother, or have the list of questions he wanted to ask God. Poppy would never stand for that anyway. Poppy always said, if you only ask God why when bad things happen, how come you don't ask him the same question about all the good? As always, Michael imagined Poppy here with him now, using that soft old catcher's mitt of his, the Johnny Bench model, whipping the ball back to Michael, telling him, now you're pitching, my son. That big smile on his face under what Michael always thought of as his Zorro mustache. If you don't know what Zorro is and what that would look like, that could be something you research. They would both laugh then. Michael couldn't remember all of Poppy's pet sayings no matter how hard he tried. Mostly he remembered the way it felt when they were just having a game of catch, everything feeling as good and right to him as a baseball held lightly in his hand. The way it did now, just sitting alone in the apartment. The way he was alone a lot of these days, rolling the ball around in his hands, feeling the seams, trying different grips. Sometimes, when he held a ball like this on the mound, before he would go into motion, Michael could trick himself into believing everything was right in the world. Sometimes. The phone rang. Michael didn't even move to answer it, knowing the house rule. Rule number 1, about never answering the phone when Carlos wasn't here. Just letting the ancient answering machine, the one with Poppy's voice, pick up. Michael wanted to change the outgoing message, but Carlos said no. It sounded better that way. The voice on the other end belonged to Mr. Minaya, his coach with the Clippers. Mr. Arroyo, Minaya began, because he called all the parents, Mr. or Mrs. You don't have to get right back to me, but once we get to the playoffs, we're going to need parents to drive to the game, and since, well, you're a professional driver, we were wondering if you might be able to help us out. Please let me know. Michael waited for the click. That meant he had disconnected, but he wasn't finished. Unless, of course, Mr. Arroyo isn't back yet, and I'm talking to Carlos and Michael. Well, forget it. Just tell your dad to give me a call whenever he does get back. Then came the click. If he ever does get back? Not when. Does he suspect something? Michael grabbed his glove off the kitchen table where he'd left it, stuffed the ball in his pocket, locked the apartment door behind him, headed for the field at Macomb Dam Park. The field had always felt like his own safe place. But now, Michael wondered if even baseball was safe. All right, so we are going to add to our list here. And there could be a couple things you have at this point. We talked about maybe looking up what Zorro's mustache may look like, and you might have put something about maybe a transistor radio that was mentioned, etc. So you're going to be going to your heat topics discussion question. Pick one of those topics to research further and post what you found out about the topic of your choice onto this discussion question so we can build our background knowledge. I'm going to stop sharing there. Also, I want you to think about the fact that Michael Arroyo uses baseball as a kind of an escape to get away from things that aren't going well in his life. Do you have a place that you go, something you do to kind of relieve your stress and get you, I don't know, at peace in a way, I guess I should say? If you would like to privately message me what that is, that would be great.